Well, next up we have Chuck Bronte with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to talk about the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program with some results from steelhead, Chinook salmon, and lake trout. And I believe he'll also work in some other information on lake trout restoration since we have a good chunk of time today for this. So thanks for being with us, Chuck, and go ahead if you're ready.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, morning, everyone. As Dan said, Chuck Bronte, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I run the mass marketing program for the service, and just wanted to shout out to the rest of the names on this presentation. This is a big program. It takes a lot of people to actually visit all the hatcheries, mark all the fish. During the year, we visit state and federal hatcheries across actually 5 states, and it's a big program. And then the second part of the program is the recovery program, and that takes even more folks. So in the summertime, we have, well, during the marking season and recovery season, we'll have up to 20 people spread out all over around Lake Michigan and Huron collecting fish and tagging fish. So thanks for visiting. My presentation will be divided into a couple of sections here. We're going to give an overview of what we did last year for tagging and recovery. We're going to talk about Chinook salmon results in general, and this is all data that's been collected over the last 10 years. Then lake trout results, and then finally steelhead results, which are just starting to come in. And unfortunately, Dan, I overlooked the the lake trout restoration stuff, but I can certainly answer questions regarding that. So I apologize. So starting off with the overview. So this program, as most people know, is a collaboration amongst all the agencies that have management authority, which does not include the Fish and Wildlife Service, by the way, but we provide technical support to all agencies that request it, and we coordinate and run the program for both tagging and recovery. Okay, it began in 2010. And this was a request from the Council of Lake Committees of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And the major impetus was to answer questions on the relative survival of stocked fish, their contribution of hatchery fish to different fisheries. Most importantly, the estimates of natural reproduction centered first around Chinook salmon, because at that time, that was relatively unknown, and the states needed to know how many wild fish were out there that they were adding stocked fish to make sure that we didn't overburden the forage base with their predation inertia, and then other measures that would help the states manage their salmoning fishery. Also, it was an opportunity to get a better handle on progress towards lake trout restoration, which is a mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states and tribes as well. So this program is funded exclusively by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Very little base funding from the service is put towards this. Luckily, the Restoration Initiative enjoys bipartisan support in Congress, which is one of the few things they can agree on. And, you know, this has been going on since 2010, and who would have ever thought that we'd still be supported by this funding initiative, and we look forward to continued funding. And we certainly thank the fishermen's support. I mean, basically, it's allowed us to collect data on over 140,000 fish from the open water angling season, and that basically runs from from about April to the middle of September. So all the data you're going to see is from the open water season, from the lake proper, not from the streams. So the program is divided into 4 sections. We got tagging in March. We have hatchery fish. Like I said, we visit up to 8 state hatcheries and 4 federal hatcheries throughout the year. Tagging begins in March and goes through about late May for Chinooks and certain steelhead stocks that are in size range. Then we have a data collection and tag recovery from the sport fishery, which starts about April in the south and carries on to about mid-September. And then all winter long, we're working on tag extraction from the snouts that we collect. We age wild fish and we process other data and lab processing occurs, and that's going on right now. And then continuously there's data analysis, which provides support to fishery managers for them making decisions on stocking rates and other things. So we tag about 9.5 million fish a year, and there's a variety of species here shown. The program was first concentrated on Chinook salmon and lake trout, and then we've moved over with the state request from the states. We've moved over into steelhead. There's been a few other smaller studies that were requested by some states to look at brown trout and brook trout. So it's and then we used to tag for the Michigan DNR's program for Atlantic salmon. They've actually started doing that in the last 4 years, but we're going to pick that up again soon. So we have an extensive sport fishery survey where I send technicians out. We have teams of technicians based in our office in New Franken, which is near Green Bay, and we put folks down at Milwaukee DNR. We used to put a team at Zion in Illinois. We got a team at Michigan City and Charlevoix, and then over in Alpena. So these are the kind of the focal points of where folks leave and travel to various cities. You can see some of the numerous ports we sample. So we got 6 teams and we visit 40 ports a year. Last year we looked at 11,000 fish collectively, mostly from Lake Michigan, but some from Lake Huron. And this survey is unlike creel surveys, which are geared towards estimating the demographics of the fishermen and fishing effort and total catch. We're concentrating solely on collecting data and samples from your catches, and this gives us a great source of tag recoveries, as well as opportunities to collect data and specimens for other studies. And last year we started to develop opportunities for student interns through the Student Conservation Association, and they're working alongside our Fish and Wildlife Service technicians, helping with the collection program and gaining some early experience. So in the lab, the tags are extracted from the snouts of the fish that this recovery team collects. And up to date, we've looked at over 130,000 tag recoveries from all species. And this is certainly one of the largest tag recovery projects or programs, I would say, in the country. And we're estimating, like I said, ages of wild fish, from scales, from otoliths, which are the ear bones, and from the jaw bones, the maxillae. And we do we're going to do about 3,000 fish from collections made in 2022. We've got all the steelhead and a Chinook aged. We're just now working on lake trout otoliths from the wild fish. So as we all know, coded wire tag returns are used to estimate the levels of wild reproduction from lake trout, steelhead, and Chinook. We can look at movements because we know based on the tag code who stocked the fish, where they stocked them, when they stocked them, at what size they stocked them, and all that stuff, all the good stuff. And we know their year class assignments. So all the return information is fairly unambiguous. And we're certain about that. We can look at contributions to fisheries, who's catching whose fish. We can calculate relative survival of each tag lot by looking at the recovery rates. And it's used to estimate the growth rates as well. All this data are provided to modeling teams that are made up of state, tribal, and service folks and USGS folks that use in models that can inform policy decisions on stocking and possibly harvest regulations. It's used basically to develop statistical catch and age models so we can see what the stock size was given the level of harvest and the age composition. It's also used in the predator-prey ratio, which is important when states are setting stocking policy to make sure that the total predatory inertia from both stocked and wild fish is not exceeding the available prey base, which we saw from Dave Warner's presentation has been declining over time. Our field survey capabilities, we also leverage that for collaborative studies that are nested in, and these go anywhere from sea lamprey wounding, not only that's traditionally been collected on just lake trout, but we have data now on steelhead and Chinook salmon, and that's something we have led and published on. We're working with MSU and a variety of collaborators, both state and tribal and federal, on looking more at salmon and trout diets. This has been going on for a while. This is important, not only to look at what's in their stomachs, but looking at stable isotopes, which help us determine the kind of the food niche of where all the 5 principal salmonine predators are sitting, to look at levels of competition. We're looking at the natal origin of wild steelhead, Chinook, and coho in conjunction with Kevin Pangol over at Central Michigan, basically so we can tell where, based on the otolith microchemistry, where these fish were born and the origins of them. And we've also looked at the genetic composition of the wild lake trout because we stock a variety of different genetic strains, and we've seen some increase in the number of wild lake trout, and as part of an evaluation, we do not want to know which genetic strains are producing these wild fish, and it's always a hybrid of strains, but some strains contribute more than others, and some of these are in various stages of progress, and we can report on them in the future. And we also look at, in cooperation with Notre Dame, we provide a lot of samples so they can look at biocontamination. PFAS is a big issue now, and we've provided a lot of specimens to Notre Dame, and that stuff's being written up and submitted to journals. So I'm going to move on to the Chinook salmon results. So some of the questions that are important to managers and stakeholders is, what's the proportion of the population that comprise wild fish? we need to know that since forage base is at an all-time low. Again, do not want to stock too many hatchery fish on top of the wild fish. So we go about by looking at the ratio of coated wire tagged fish to untagged fish, we can estimate what the wild production looking like. Who's catching whose hatchery fish? I think there's always been an assumption that if you stock fish outside my port, they're going to be available to me all year round. Well, we know that that is not the case. The probability of you catching a fish during the open water season that was stocked in the area is actually pretty low, given the movement of these fish. And again, how far do salmon move from where they're stocked, and do they come back to where they were stocked? And we know that they do, and I'll show you some data on that. And we look at differences in post-release survival among the stocking locations, because we know how many fish were stocked at each location. We look at the proportion of the returns in the fishery from all locations, and we can estimate we can provide an estimate of relative survival. So again, to estimate the wild fish production, we're estimating the percentage of wild fish throughout the lake. We use a ratio to estimate how many wild fish must have been present given the known number of stocked fish and what we know from our sampling. Again, using the presence and absence of the adipose fin as our diagnostic tool. All ones that have the adipose fin removed are from a hatchery. If they have a coated wire tag in their nose, we know where they were stocked and who stocked them. And those that have an adipose fin intact are clearly from lake produced. And we know this, we have a pretty good accuracy rate. There's very little error in using this technique, since almost 100% of the unclipped fish are wild. We do get some regeneration, which causes to misclassify the fish, but these are inconsequential. So if we look at the results from the last several year classes, actually up until about 2010, that the estimates of percent wild were based on tetracycline marks that the states put in the feed of the fish in the hatcheries. And starting in 2011, solid on, it's all been coated wire tags. And we can see the average for the time series is about 63% of the fish in Lake Michigan are wild. So we did have an unmarked year class in 2020 because of COVID. We weren't allowed to travel to the state hatcheries to mark them. So we've gone about estimating wild recruitment through a variety of ways. In 2022, 80% of the salmon observed were unclipped, but some of those were stocked fish that were not clipped or tagged because of COVID. So we estimate the wild recruitment from the 2020 year class as an average of the most 3 recent years, both before and after. And the wild production was estimated at 3 million, almost 6 million, and almost 8 million smolts for the 2018, 2019, and 2021 year classes, respectively. And so we estimate that the average wild production was about 5.5 million fish for that 2020 year class that we didn't get to mark, which results in about 64% wild fish that year for that year class. So here's the historical data showing the stocked fish in orange and the wild estimates in blue. And we have, let's see, I gotta move this something on. There we go. So for the 2020 year class, we're estimating about 5.5 million wild fish. And these are all estimated now at age 2, and about 8.6 total. And for the 2021 year class, we're looking at about 7.7 million wild and just under 11 million total. So the trajectory of wild fish production and combined with hatchery production has been going up. So you should be seeing more total fish available in the coming years. As most of you know, in the Pacific Northwest, where these fish come from, they move all over the North Pacific. And so there's no surprise. You've seen this before. These figures show, the figure on the left shows fish that were landed at Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And the circles show where those fish landed at Manitowoc were stocked in those districts. And the size of the circle is proportion to their contribution to the catch at Manitowoc. So fish from all over that are stocked all over Lake Michigan feed that fishery during the open water season, as well as some fish from northern Lake Huron. Another example on the right is fish landed at Frankfort. Again, I mean, very few fish, actually no fish are stocked in that district there in the MM6. Yet the fishermen that land fish there, the origin of their fish is, again, from all over Lake Michigan and northern Lake Huron as well. And we know from these coated wire tag returns that most of the stocked Lake Huron fish move into Lake Michigan to feed. As you know, alewife collapsed several years ago in Lake Huron. That Chinook fishery is clearly not what it used to be. So we by looking at the tag returns from April through July, and the reason why we bracket that is because fish, after July start actually moving back to where they were stocked or where they were born. 94% of the Chinook salmon stocked into Lake Huron were actually recovered in Lake Michigan, and that's based on the tag returns. And inversely, most of the fish that were stocked in Lake Michigan were actually recovered in Lake Michigan. So movement is only in one direction, pretty much during the open water season, from Lake Huron to Lake Michigan. And obviously they're moving there mostly to take advantage of some of the higher forage base here, and most of them are actually recovered in the northern part of the lake and in Green Bay. It's amazing how consistent this is over time. Excuse me. So let's talk about what they do during the year. So this plot shows the percentage of fish captured that were stocked nearby. As you can see, it's pretty low during June, July, and August, and that's the red line. So you can see less than 10% or less of the fish that were stocked nearby are actually landed in the district or nearby where they were stocked, where they were caught. And inversely, the wild fish, most of them, they're captured during this feeding time, but then they decline over time as the season progresses, presumably leaving the areas to go back to where they were either stocked or born, and there's that transition time between in August. So, and during the spawning season, the stocked fish return. Most of them return to where they were stocked. So we haven't upset the balance or the natural cycle of these animals. So, but I just wanted to highlight that very few fish during the June, July, and early August that are caught and landed were stocked nearby. They're coming from all over. So, where are these wild fish coming from? It seems that, even though we're catching a lot of wild fish in Wisconsin, that tapers off as the season progresses, and they're moving elsewhere to spawn. And we think these and the same thing, with the wild fish in Michigan, they're increasing during the spawning time. So we're presumed that these wild fish from Wisconsin are going to Michigan to spawn. So I'm going to go to let's see. And then if we looked at the timing of arrival of homing fish, it appears that, these fish return earlier in the southern units of the lake, as indicated by the figure here, and later in the northern units. And that the highest CPEs of wild fish occur in northeastern Lake Michigan, like MM5, where, we don't stock any hatchery fish, but that seems to where we get the highest catch per unit efforts of wild fish, suggesting that fish are originating there. Very little natural reproduction going on in Wisconsin and southern Lake Michigan. And the fish are always higher somewhere where they're low. So you can see this progression as low point in CPUEs are on the Michigan side in July and August, and lowest in mid to late August, and so on. So higher catch rates in Wisconsin correlate with lower catch weights in Michigan, and vice versa. So this is looking at relative survival of the stocked fish. And we've partitioned the data out, looking at the returns in different statistical districts. For those folks on who fish on the Wisconsin side, their relative survival is consistently high along that shoreline, and variable in northern Lake Michigan. And we know this by not only looking at the returns in those areas, but looking at the lake-wide returns. So survival of fish stocked in Wisconsin, in these Wisconsin districts in blue, is the highest. And unfortunately, it's the lowest in MM6, and not certain why, but it seems like there's likely, it's habitat related, it's forage related. You got to remember, these fish, once they're stocked, they move everywhere. But these may be related to early life history, survival differences, because soon after, those fish are moving all around the lake. So some take-home messages on Chinook salmon. Wild production varies from year to year and is currently trending upward. Chinook salmon move long distances but return to their stocking areas to spawn. Wild fish mostly originate from northeastern Lake Michigan. And seasonal high and low catches occur at different times in Wisconsin and Michigan shores. And spawning fish return earlier in the south versus the north. And fish stocked in Wisconsin have the highest relative survival compared to virtually anywhere else in Lake Michigan. And moving on to the lake trout results now. And again, just a reminder, there's been a lot of talk, at least among the biologists, about the metric called percent wild to evaluate the progress towards a self-sustaining population. That's an artifact of a ratio of how many wild fish you have compared to the total number of lake trout you looked at. That's really not that sensitive. So what we look at is relative abundance of wild and hatchery fish, and those are much better metrics of progress towards a self-sustaining population. So what you want to do is see wild fish relative abundance in either your assessment fishery or your sport fishery increase, and that's the metric you want to hone in on. Having said that, I'm going to show you the percent wild trends that we collect from the sport fishery over time for Lake Huron, Southern Lake Michigan, and Northern Lake Michigan. So in Lake Huron, that percent wild has been going up to 70% in recent years. In Southern Lake Michigan, which seems to be the focal point of restoration in Lake Michigan, mostly from the Mid-Lake Reef Complex and from Illinois waters off Julian's Reef, we see that almost half of the fish are wild, but I'll show you why that probably is sounding better than it actually is. But there is, the contrast between Northern and Southern Lake Michigan is stark. We have very little evidence of wild reproduction going on in Northern Lake Michigan. We've got sea lamprey still an issue coming out of the Manistique River, and we have a fishery located in that area as well, commercial fishery. Now here's the relative abundance data. So again, positive trends in Lake Huron. So this is based on catch rate, numbers of fish caught, and corrected for excuse me, for the sampling effort. And we see good stuff going on in Lake Michigan. It's been going on for quite a while. And now in Southern Lake Michigan, we see that that trend is going up as it is in Northern Lake Michigan. But, if we look at just Southern Lake Michigan, the hatchery fish are declining because stocking rates have been reduced by the state of Wisconsin. And you can see the influence it has on the percent wild numbers on the bottom there. It's basically, that's not a great metric of the percent wild is not a good metric, although we have 52% wild lake trout in, let's say, 2022. It's still a fairly low number. The trend is upward though, but not as dramatic as we would hope. So wild CPE actually, from the sport fishery, actually exceeded hatchery CPE in 20 and 21. And the wild and hatchery CPE have obviously opposite trajectories that result in an increase in percent wild. It's the CPUE, or the relative abundance, that's important in evaluating restoration. And we can see that, our data from the sport fishery, and we're using Southern Lake Michigan as an example, on the left-hand side here, actually tracks the fishery independent gillnet surveys that's pictured on the right, where hatchery lake trout abundance is declining because of declining stocking in Wisconsin principally, and wild lake trout numbers are slightly increasing. Still far away from self-sustainability, and certainly not where we want to be. And here's that decline in stocking rates these are in non-refuge waters in Southern Lake Michigan, which strongly influences any percent wild calculation. So there has been some criticism of the fact that we stock most of these fish offshore, and there's a reason for that. These offshore areas historically provided most of the wild recruitment for lake trout in Lake Michigan, both the Northern Refuge, the numerous reefs surrounding the Beaver Island area and south of Beaver Island, and then the 4 major reefs in the Southern Refuge, which are known as the Mid-Lake Reef or the Southern Refuge. However, looking at the harvest, where the sport harvest comes from, if you look at Illinois, Indiana, looking at the blue bars, they're representing most of the sport harvest. So even though most of the fish get stocked offshore, they find their way to nearshore areas in Illinois and Indiana, as well as in Wisconsin waters, where most of the fish, again, are from the Northern Refuge and the Southern Refuge in Julian's Reef, you can see there, which is a very productive reef historically and showing a lot of wild fish, actually. And the same in Michigan waters for at least for some of the regions. So the fact that we have fish mostly being stocked offshore, they are providing a source for most of the sport fisheries, especially in the southern and western part of the lake. And certainly, yeah. So this is a plot showing the lake trout relative survival. So that we basically look at the return rate to the fisheries corrected for stocking, and looking at those fish. The results show that most fish that are stocked in these offshore locations have a higher survival, especially in the Southern Refuge and Julian's Reef, compared to nearshore areas. So we're placing these fish out in the best habitat, and it appears that they're surviving much better, but able then to move to nearshore areas to provide fishing opportunities there. Nearshore, some of the relative survival is not as good. So we just wanted to show you the contrast in that. So as with Chinook salmon, lake trout don't necessarily stay where they're stocked, and that's a good thing. But here's a couple examples. The figure on the right shows lake trout that are stocked in Indiana waters. Most of the recoveries are in southeast Michigan, parts of Lake Michigan, and as you move further away, fewer recoveries are there. So they do move, but not as extensive as Chinook salmon. Another example on the right-hand side is showing fish that are stocked in the area of northeastern Lake Michigan. Those fish are stocked caught both north and south of there, but usually, if the lake trout aren't caught in their home stocking district, it's usually the next districts over that is where they're moving to. And then if we look at the recoveries from just the Southern Refuge, we see they're contributing quite a bit to the fisheries all over Lake Michigan, certainly mostly around mid to southern Lake Michigan. And then we've calculated the dispersal range for lake trout, and unfortunately these are represented in kilometers, but I've basically looked at actually presented some mileage calculations there. most of the fish are within about 62 miles of where they're stocked. They're caught within 62 miles of where they're stocked, and that varies depending on where they were stocked. But basically, all converge on that 100-kilometer or 62-mile range, and that's very consistent with other studies, not only from Lake Michigan, but also from Lake Superior as well. So, lake trout take-home points. Okay, some of the increases we've been seeing in wild recruitment are due to declines in the stocking of hatchery-reared fish, but also due to some modest increases in the numbers of wild fish. Trends in wild fish are encouraging, but certainly not at management targets in many areas. Sport fish landings in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Illinois are mostly from fish stocked offshore. In Michigan, they're mostly benefiting from offshore fish in the southern part of Michigan waters. Fish stocked offshore have a higher relative survival and supply near for fisheries, and certainly movement is more localized compared to salmon. Lastly, I'm going to talk about steelhead results. Managers and stakeholders, they're interested in learning more about steelhead, centered around these questions of how many wild fish are out there, how far do steelhead move and from where they're stocked, and who's catching whose fish, and are there differences in relative survival among stocking locations and genetic strains. So because steelhead, they take about 3 years to fully recruit to the sport fishery, we're just starting to get some of the data that we need to do a complete analysis. So some of this stuff is very preliminary at this time. Excuse me. So again, we estimate the percentage of wild fish based on the ratios of fin clipped and non-fin clipped, or those with a coated wire tag and an adipose fin removed. And we again estimate how many wild fish must have been present to give given the known numbers of stocked fish that were recovering. So it's basically a ratio. So unfortunately, due to COVID, and we missed the 2020 field season. We didn't mark a year class. For some reason, this is advancing. Okay. Overall, we do have estimates though that we've derived. So for the 2027 year class, 45% of the fish are wild. For the 2018 year class, about 40%. For the 2019, about 33%. And those are estimated at various ages. And this is certainly consistent with an otolith microchemistry study that was done by Ben Breaker and Michigan DNR and Central Michigan folks, where they, based on the microchemistry results, they classified about 40% of the observed steelhead were considered wild fish, because there's a clear chemistry differences between the otoliths in hatchery-reared fish versus wild fish. And that's a paper that's in preparation right now. So looking at what this means in terms of the year classes of stocked versus smolts. So we got in 2017, we got a total of 3.6 million steelhead, and of those 1.6 were wild. 2018, about 1.3 million wild smolts on top of this, what was stocked, gives you 3.3 million smolts for the 2018 year class, and from the 2019 year class, we have about 100, or rather 1 million wild fish. So wild fish production seems to be going down for these 3-year classes that we have data for. So next thing is we're looking at movements. And so this is, unfortunately, this again, some of this is in kilometers, but just looking at the recoveries in these different areas, we have about 92 miles plus or minus 61 miles, which suggests a very variable rate of movement of where the fish were stocked to where they were landed. So about 92 miles, which is fairly similar to Chinook salmon, steelhead or Pacific salmon. They're in the same genus. No reason why they wouldn't have some similar behavioral. So these fish are moving as much as the Chinook salmon, and that varies by area, but pretty much are pretty close to each other. So here's some examples of movement maps. So here are fish that were stocked in Indiana waters, and this is where they were recovered. And the size of the circles indicates where they were recovered, or the abundance of where they were recovered. And then fish stocked in this area in Wisconsin waters, we see where steelhead were recovered throughout the lake. So fish move around. Same with Chinook salmon. Don't expect to catch a steelhead in the summertime that was stocked there. These fish move around quite a bit. So interlake movement, there is some steelhead stocked in Lake Huron that move into Lake Michigan. 24% of the steelhead stocked in the Lake Huron were recovered in Lake Michigan. Far fewer percentage than Chinook salmon. So steelhead are certainly more resident in Lake Huron than the Chinook are, but almost all the steelhead stocked into Lake Michigan were recovered in Lake Michigan. Again, there's no preference for Lake Michigan fish to move into Lake Huron, and likely that's forage-based related. So relative survival, we're looking at this in terms of the returns. Here we're comparing fall fingerlings to yearlings. This has been shown very consistently over time, certainly way before we started doing mass marking, where survival rate is 3 times greater for yearlings and fingerlings. 20 to 25% of the steelhead stocked are stocked as fingerlings, but only 4 to 7% appear in the sport harvest. So certainly a decision for managers to consider in continuing the fingerling stocking. And we see that relative survival is variable depending on stocking location. This figure shows looking at the 17, 18, and 19 year classes. As you can see, the areas in blue on the map refer to the bars of relative survival on the bar chart to the left. Those areas have higher relative survival compared to the areas in yellow, compared to the areas in red, which have the lowest relative survival. Again, quite a bit different than we're seeing for Chinook salmon, where Wisconsin was kind of like the honey hole for survival. It appears Michigan has much better relative survival in the fish stocked in those areas in blue. So we look at relative survival comparisons between genetic strains. So it appears that the survival was similar from the preliminary data that we have. was similar for Skamania and Michigan strains, lake-wide. Skamania did better in Indiana, but the two strains were even in Michigan. That's a caveat. Ganaraska strain had a higher relative survival than Chambers Creek in 3 of the Wisconsin units. And these strains grow quite different. Their trajectories are pretty similar, but there is some differences in the strains where Skamanias grow the fastest and Ganaraskas grow the slowest. So, some of the wrap-up conclusions for steelhead are about 30 to 40% of the fish you capture, or those out in the lake, are wild. As we saw from Dan's presentation, that was quite different on a stream by stream basis, but when these fish are all mixed in the lake, this is the number we come up with. And about 1 to 1.6 million wild smolts are produced annually. They move distances similar to Chinook salmon. There's certain areas that have better relative survival than others. There's some strain-specific differences in survival and growth weight, as well as differences between fall fingerlings and yearlings, where yearlings do 3 times better. And that's all I have. Thanks for your attention. Contact Matt Cornish or myself at our email addresses if you want to learn more. Matt produced this presentation. I'm just the talking head, and thank you very much.